Alyssa, why don't you start with some opening thoughts on the High Priestess, specifically from the perspective of the Rider Waite deck?
Sure. I think it's helpful to start to think about the High Priestess in relation to the first major arcana, the Magician, that came before this. We touched upon this last month, but the Magician really marks a birth of conscious awareness, this expansion that allows someone to start gaining this awareness of your ability to affect the environment, to have willpower, to manifest action and agency, the power to create. And that sort of expansive principle is then balanced by the High Priestess, which is much more of this contraction inward. And we start to get into this more subtle experience of consciousness. And I go so far as to say that the High Priestess represents the unconscious totality in a lot of aspects, because we start to get into the inner principle, the elements of esotericism, the invitation to stillness. The priestess, especially in the Rider Waite, holds all of this really dynamic symbolism that is about entering into the waters of the unknown. We can see the veil of the pomegranates, kind of reminding us of Persephone and the underworld, and behind it, this large body of water, which of course represents more of that dynamic unconscious space. And she is the entrance point into that. We kind of come at her feet and are initiated into the mysteries of life with the High Priestess. So when she comes up, especially in a Rider Waite reading, it's really about sensing hidden potential, embracing the unknown, the initiation into mysteries that allows us to get into the more unconscious space, the messages, the insights that flow up more subtly. And it's that inward dynamic, that return to the kind of the cosmic whole that exists inside of us, in contrast to that more expansive principle of the Magician. So I'll start there. Maybe we'll move to Matt next.
So the High Priestess is interesting in that the Rider Waite and later decks call it the High Priestess, but it's actually that's also an innovation from some of the older decks, especially the Marseille, where the title of the title is the Popess, or La Papesse, if I'm saying that right. Somebody can correct my French. But there is a slight difference there. Well, it's a significant difference that I think does color in some ways how the Marseille tradition kind of like looks at that. There are some really interesting there's some interesting history or proposed history around the inclusion of a female pope, with some legends that are attached to it, of a female pope named Pope Joan. There's also some discussion that there's this may be an allusion to a particular woman who was a nun in a heretical order whose family was one of the original commissioners of the Visconti Forza deck. So there's some kind of interesting history there, and I just kind of want to point that out a little bit. As far as what the High Priestess means to me, I think in a lot of ways I echo what Alyssa said about that sort of. I also think that there is an interesting, a lot of the symbolism points to not so much just a turning inward, but a pulling down of when these sort of like, it's almost like this bridge between the mystical experience of touching something out there in the ether and in the sky, and sort of beginning to make it manifest in a different way than the magician makes it manifest. One of the things that's interesting about the Popess in the Marseille is that she's holding a book, and some have sort of said this is like the beginning of the recording or the reflection of the ultimate truth being written down in a transmissible form. There's also this, there's connections to these powerful feminine archetypes. And one of the ones that I think most directly correlates with the Popess or the High Priestess is the archetype of Sophia, or wisdom. And so there's, it's kind of like an interesting bridge into what is wisdom and how do we access it and who is it for, and all of that I think is really fascinating about that card.
Chris, thoughts on the Thoth?
So I think you hit the nail on the head, Matt, when you describe it as a drawing down. She is the link between the unconscious and the conscious. And in many ways, humanity paying attention to the moon is really the beginning of our exploration of space, our understanding of astronomy and astrology, because it's the most dynamic presence in the sky, other than the sun, of course, the most dynamic presence in the night sky, constantly changing and, you know, directly influencing us, as we knew back then and we still kind of know now, influencing the tides, influencing periods. The moon has the most direct connection to us. So it makes sense that our first step into initiation would be with the thing that is closest to us. And another point that I thought we've reached a significant point, because the past two cards, the Fool and the Magician in Thoth, are both relatively hermaphroditic. They're both hermaphrodites. They're not truly masculine archetypes, but we have now reached the gendered archetypes. The priestess is truly feminine and is a directly feminine card.
As the second major arcana, we start to see some really interesting development. And I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts of her placement in the sort of sequential order of the major arcana. What does it mean to have her placed at this point, both after the Magician, but as a whole coming so early in the lineup?
I'll speak from my own personal experiences. I think I mentioned to you all after our talk the last time that I had a really significant dream related to the High Priestess. And this dream was at the very beginning of my exploration of Jung and of the occult. And I was in an old Roman town amidst baths, and there was an older woman sitting, and before her was a basin of water. And I went up to her and she said, "I'm going to teach you magic." And there was a key in the basin at that point, and she pointed to it, and it grew twice its size. And so it was very much the beginning of initiation. She was literally handing me the key, showing how to begin the journey. So when the Fool, the everyman, one has to then become interested in magic. And from there, she is kind of like you mentioned earlier, Alyssa, she's the doorway to this unconscious experience, to this journey.
Some of my own thoughts in regards to the High Priestess as sort of a step after the Magician is there is kind of like the undifferentiated wholeness of the Fool, of like the emptiness which can be filled as it journeys. And the Magician is kind of this first step on the journey, more of the heroic journey in some sense of being kind of extroverted or kind of expanding, or kind of developing this power of going out. And I see the Priestess in some sense being the next logical step, which is how to come back in, or how to go inward, the heroine's journey. And sort of these early experiences of development for consciousness is one of kind of expanding outward, leaving the womb of the mother, kind of being taken by the father into consciousness in some sense, beginning to differentiate with the Magician, but that can go too far and that can become unhealthy. And there has to be this second tool of going back into the mother and having that kind of ability to breathe, expanding outward, extroverted, the hero, also contracting inward, back down, back into the depths of the unconscious with the High Priestess. And those being is like the two fundamental kind of patterns of development of this kind of expanding outward, contracting inward, and the Priestess being the next logical step. I also see it sort of just in life in general. I think Jung kind of talked about this, is like the first part of life is one of expanding, one of kind of being the hero and kind of going out and making your way in the world. And the second half of life is really about kind of like stopping and then learning how to come back in, go inward, and kind of slowly, submerge back into the origin from whence you came, you might say.
I think another way that I look at the Priestess is in relation to card 3, the Empress, because as this sort of form of ego consciousness is being born out of the Magician, our first relationship is to the mother and to the feminine principle. And we see this more esoteric, subtle, spiritual depth side with the High Priestess and more of that earth mother with the Empress. And together they create this interesting totality of the great mother archetype. And that's the relationship that comes after the Magician. Like, we don't get to the Emperor or the Hierophant until after this point, after we come into relationship with the feminine. So I think that's another aspect that I look at when I see her in the development of the major arcana, is like, we need this fundamental foundational structure to really continue our development and to become more of a sense of wholeness of our person.
Yeah, and I think one clue that we get that we're going that way is that this is the first character in a series of characters that's seated. The Fool is up and doing stuff. The Magician is standing in this very dynamic posture. And then the High Priestess has now taken a seat. And there is definitely a sense of purposefulness about what she's doing, but the activity is not happening outwardly, as Arran mentioned. It's happening. There's activity here, but it's happening in a container. It's happening in a seating. There's also some of the imagery, and really in all of these decks. I see it very explicitly in the Marseille. There's this kind of like veil behind her, this kind of like curtain that's sort of like walling her off from things, and it's almost and even the clothes that she's wearing. There's in the Marseille and in the Rider Waite, she's very heavily clothed and has all of this. There's nothing of the body shown here. There's this kind of like covering and walling and going, but there's this idea that she's doing this for a reason. There's a focus that she's beginning to explore. And then, as we go through the other cards, there's a series of several more cards that are seated, so we kind of stay in these different modes of internal activity until we kind of come back out again later.
I wanted to speak a bit to what Alyssa was saying earlier with the Empress being another element of the Great Mother. So I agree, and that there's a third, what Crowley viewed as the triple goddess as related to tarot is the priestess, the empress, and the star. And that with that you get, you know, the maiden, the mother, and the crone, though one is wont to call the star the crone. But we get, you know, we do get a very clear image that just by, you know, one can infer from her position that she is chaste, she's a virgin. Nuns and women in clergy generally are not having sex. And so the priestess as a virginal character within the feminine is very significant, especially in Thoth, where there are a lot of really expressly sexual characters. She is marked by her being virginal.
It's really interesting because I was wondering for a moment if the star might carry some more of those like maiden qualities as well, because she seems, at least, I don't know, I have to pull up the Thoth deck, but you know, in the star rider Waite, there's a real youthful openness to her. But I think being so much later in the major arcana lineup, you see a much sort of higher development of wisdom and experience in the star that brings more of that sense of healing and rebalancing that really comes more with age, and that sense of maturity that can kind of guide younger consciousness through the difficult storms. So I really like that that point, Chris. And I was wondering if we could touch back on the veil that Matt was bringing up, because all three of the priestesses have some form of this kind of veil imagery. And I think the symbolism is extremely powerful. And I mentioned in my opening thoughts that the Rider Waite priestess has the veil of palms and pomegranates. And to me, it's always brought up this a sort of reminder of the underworld itself, and Persephone as the kind of queen of the underworld who ate the pomegranate seeds and kind of sealed her fate as being the sort of feminine counterpart in Hades. And sitting between the pillars here, Boaz and Jachin, you know, this reminiscent of the Temple of Solomon, you get this depth of spiritual sacredness and the entrance into that underworld space, and that she sits at that veil of consciousness. And it's really through the priestess as that initiator, as a kind of like gatekeeper, a guardian, you might say, that we can enter into that. But we have to sit at her feet, humble ourselves, allow ourselves to learn from her to be able to enter into Hades. And I'm curious of what you guys think of the veil and the other decks. How do you view it symbolically?
I don't necessarily I guess, how do I want to say this? I think of the veil, at least in the Marseille deck, as having to me, it has this very like sensory blocking perspective. And that might just be me sort of like projecting my own stuff here, which is how you work with tarot anyway, hopefully. But you know, I know that for me to spend any time in contemplation or in any kind of serious work, I have to do a lot to make sure, like I've got blackout curtains everywhere in case I need it. I've got sound canceling headphones that I need to put on sometimes for things. And to me, I see the veil that she has as this curtain behind her. One of the things that's interesting is there's no landscape in the Marseille. It's like she is in a room of some kind, perhaps, but there's no features of the natural world here. It's almost like she's got a very specific purpose in what she's attending to and where her attention is going and for what purpose. So that's kind of how I see the veil.
So in Thoth, the veil is not clothing her, and it's not behind her the way it is in the other two. It is what she is producing, casting, and the figures and forms before her are kind of products of the veil. The veil is, light, appearances, forms, as they emanate from the unconscious. And that point, I think, is really significant. And it's just kind of to contextualize it in the experience, we have kind of an inverted presence of the priestess in Parsifal, in the figure of Kundry, who kisses Parsifal and kind of forces him into awareness. She, because Percival is pierce the veil, and it is done through his interaction with Kundry, this witch, an evil form of the priestess. But there's a quick thing I wanted to mention, because I think there's a really important mirror to the I Ching and to a commentary on the I Ching as it relates to the productivity of the unconscious in the priestess. So basically, I'll get the little bit. The holy sages were able to survey all the movements under heaven. They contemplated the way in which these movements met and became interrelated. To take their course according to eternal laws, they appended judgments, etc., blah, blah, blah. They observed forms and phenomena and made representations of things and their attributes. These were called the images. And that the underlying reality, there is a world of archetypes, and reproductions of these make up the real things in the material world. The world of archetypes is heaven. The world of reproductions is the earth. So that is the middle ground here is the priestess. The priestess is the forms and the animating ideas behind them. So she is both sides of the veil in Thoth.
Real quick, I see that sort of manifesting also in the between the pillars, black and white. There's kind of like she's in the middle of like the black and the white. She's the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. I also wonder if in the Thoth card, Chris, is these sort of weird structures that she's producing. They look like diamonds, but they might just be kind of strange, like sacred geometry. If that is tapping into what you're talking about as far as the forms go, is that she has both these like worldly fruits, almost like there's like grapes there, but there's also these like strange psychedelic shapes that she's producing, and she is in some sense kind of the bridge between the two. Does that resonate?
All of those things are images just of the forms that are produced from, you can see the kind of central point in the moon at her head and at her arms, and all of it is manifested in these, jewels and grapes and pods and camels, all these things.
That quote that you read from the I Ching makes me think of we've gone quite a few minutes before I actually mentioned Valentin Tomberg, so I got to make sure I rectify that. So I'm going to bust out some meditations on the tarot here. He actually connects the High Priestess in a very similar way with this, the world, the things that are true in the world of forms and in the world of archetype. In the world of ideas, becoming manifest in the world of forms. And he says that the book that she's holding is the book of Revelation. And when he says it's the book of Revelation, he doesn't just mean the apocalypse of John that we call the book of Revelation. He also means that, but he also means the revelation of the world of ideas manifest in the world of experience and archetype, or in the world of experience, phenomenologically. And there's an idea that he talks about a certain contrapuntal movement of how things go from the higher planes to the denser planes, that I think is sort of interesting and touches at some of the energy of what the High Priestess has. He sort of pictures her crown. Of course, he's working from the Marseille as this layer, this like filter of these 3 layers that come down before things manifest into the book. And one of the things that he says is that the kind of, the very first thing that happens as a person touches, the world of ideas, or the world of the archetypes, or the spirit realm, or any of these words you want to use for it, is this kind of like mystical experience. You just have some awareness of it. But it's like touch, and then there's gnosis, which is a different kind of knowing, and that's more like hearing, perhaps. You hear something and you're like, well, what does that mean? And then you have to kind of like work to sort of understand what it is that you mean and then implement it, right? So there's this progression, or this process of how things go from there to something that you can use. And all these sort of like images that we keep coming to of the High Priestess is sort of like the gate, or the veil, or the thing that has to be gone through. There's like this very important stage that has to happen, that has to we have to spend some time with before we can make use of it. And one of the things that he says is that things that start out in gnosis are what ends up becoming facts, right? Like the facts of the world are things that start out as this kind of like germination of an idea. And he contrasts that with the way science works, which is where we take facts and then we put the facts together and figure out abstractions from them and start to like generalize principles and all this stuff. There's almost this kind of like reverse order in terms of how revelation happens, as opposed to how science happens. So there's like different types of knowledge, and in our culture now we prioritize one of that much higher than we prioritize the other, and we get some good things out of that. But I think there's some call in the High Priestess to look at other ways of knowing and other ways of experiencing things too.
What you've said, Matt, sorry, Alyssa, it'll be quick. It strikes me so clearly as like William Blake, that idea of the book of Revelation is that idea of it not just being the apocalypse. It reminds me really clearly of the marriage of heaven and hell. When the doors of perception are clear, all will be seen as it is, infinite. And it is that form of perceiving that has to be attained through this journey. But the idea that she gives the revelation, she clears the doors to witness these things. I like that a lot.
I just wanted to speak a little bit more to like the layers within the priestess, and I think that the Rider Waite gives these implications of the layers of experience and the cycles through all the moon imagery. We see like the waxing moon at her feet, and there's the implication then as the priestess as the moon, which I think Chris brought up earlier, kind of like our first relationship really to this principle came through worship of the moon and her cycles and how she affects the tides and individuals, and that there's these different stages that reveal different things. Or we even think about this from a more ritualistic point of view, that the stages of the moon and the cycles that they are going through represents different forms of development, and that what we symbolize the crescent moon as and its waxing or waning fame will be very different than its new moon or full moon phase. And so within her we see this multiplicity of wisdom and potential and grace and depth, and that kind of gets disseminated down through all of these different layers. And where we peer into the mirror and see the priestess at, I think that's colored by what the certain dynamics of the environment really are. And so she sort of shape shifts in a really interesting way, where she isn't just the moon at her fullness, but she is also the dark moon, and she is the waning and the waxing, and that paradoxical nature, especially implied here, I think, in that kind of yin and yang style of the pillars, and how she represents both, you know, consciousness and coming into relationship with unconscious, but then kind of flowing outward and becoming grounded again. So just a couple of thoughts there.
In both of our cards, you can see that in her hat. She has the phases of the moon all there.
I was thinking maybe we could try and relate the High Priestess to certain manifestations in fiction or myth or pop culture. One of the ways that like I've interpreted the High Priestess is sort of like the heroine as opposed to the hero, but maybe that's not quite right. For instance, like in Game of Thrones, I would say that like maybe Jon's the magician and like Sansa is the High Priestess in some sense. He's on a hero's journey. She's on more kind of a heroine's journey, a journey sort of inward, inner demons. But would it be more precise to say that the High Priestess is instead Melisandre or something like the crazy, you know, sorceress? Same with like in Lord of the Rings, there's Frodo is kind of like a feminine character. So is Frodo kind of like the High Priestess, or is Galadriel more accurately the High Priestess? What do you guys think as far as the way the High Priestess manifests in our fiction?
I think to Chris's point, that we see within the priestess that kind of virginal aspect, the maiden, as part of the triple feminine archetype. So within that, you might see the feminine wisdom, which we could relate also back to Isis or Sophia as part of the heroine's journey that someone like Sansa might be on. Or if we view Frodo as being more of an inward journey and a protecting of something holy, as also being on a heroine's journey, like he is also developing that feminine wisdom. So I think in that sense, you can look at through that lens and see that part of the priestess at play. But I think also within Melisandre or within Galadriel in Lord of the Rings, you absolutely also see that more of that subtle, mystical, magical principle that is also implied to me. The priestess is very much the kind of the queen of the occult, you know, she is Isis embodied in the tarot as well. And so esoteric wisdom and knowledge and ritual and sacredness is also her realm. And that to me is going to show up more as those sorceress type archetypes as well.
I'll speak a bit to the presence of the priestess in the piece that I'm writing, the work of my channel, somebody did a really brilliant depiction of one of the figures, one of the archetypes that I look at online, the digital anima, because she is the spider weaving the World Wide Web. And I think the character I mentioned earlier, Kundry from Parsifal, presents that kind of dynamic journey from a spider biting at Parsifal, but growing and kind of becoming whole and becoming good, because she detaches herself from the evil wizard who had sent her out. So I think the idea of the innocent and the virginal is really present in her, but the opposite can be present as well. She can be the end goal for somebody who felt themselves to be impure, because Kundry despises herself and her situation. She has been unable to sleep for years, and it's only through this journey that she was able to sleep.
I have a hard time thinking of a character that makes me think of the High Priestess, and I almost wonder if it is because I don't see that. This is something that I feel like the energy that the High Priestess represents, and I kind of alluded to this before. I feel like it is something that is sort of underrepresented in our culture, really. So the archetype is there, and it finds ways of peeking out, but I don't know that it gets explicated well. And so, there may be, like Chris made reference to Parsifal, and so I think sometimes that we have to go back into ancient stories and mythologies to find this, given the weight that it really deserves. I think Arran's comparison to Frodo is actually a really good one, and it's sort of like funny that can't be a female character in a way, so, and I mean, that could lead us down a whole lot of rabbit holes I'd rather not go into, but there is something that I almost feel like a sort of like the signal is only coming through to a certain extent, and then the other thing that I would say in regards to that is where I do see it is either in older stories and mythological stories, or sometimes in reading either hagiographies, or in some cases, like I've read a little bit of the writings of Saint Teresa of Avila, and in mystics, there is something of the High Priestess present. There's Saint Teresa is especially interesting because she has such a clear and brilliant mind, and she's so concerned with the intellectual contemplation of her faith, and yet there's a very intuitive and impassioned and almost erotic dimension to her explorations of these things, but she's doing it in a very analytical and cerebral way. And a more modern example of that might be Simone Weil, who had a very similar, was very intellectual, just a powerhouse mind, and yet could speak so eloquently about these deep mystical and Gnostic experiences that she had, and yet in some ways was sort of like walled off from participating in the more earthly aspects of life. That just wasn't really her deal.
I do think that there's actually a popular modern fiction character who fits it. And it's something in my card that isn't in the others, at least not literally the way it is here. She has a bow because she is Diana. She is Artemis. So you get, a maiden with a bow in Katniss. And as she's kind of unraveling the veil of the forced, the political oppression, she's rending that veil, witnessing the truth of her culture. So not a perfect fit, but the maiden with the bow might be the closest thing we can get. Huntresses. Mononoke, Princess Mononoke.
I like that, Chris. It's, I think, very implied within like the triple moon crown that we see as well, and that Diana or Artemis representing those principles of moon and the principles of the feminine counterpoint to Apollo's more like logos principle. And so it's that much more inward space of exploration and darkness, and the priestess also as the moon archetype as well. So I think we'll move into some questions. So if you guys attending have any questions that you want to ask the panel, make sure to drop it into the chat. And I'm going to start actually with a audience submitted question that came in earlier. This is from Mariana, and she asks, what lessons do you believe the High Priestess means to teach us about ourselves? And I think this is a nice question because we're going to like ground this more philosophical exploration that we've been doing. And an important thing to remember as we interact with the tarot and the power of these archetypes and symbolism is, how do we ground this back into our experience? How do we use this as a tool of self-development and navigation? And for me, I'll start at least that whenever the priestess really arrives, I think it's always that invitation towards stillness and turning inward, where we can get so caught up in the dynamics of everyday life and that we forget that sort of subtle inner wisdom that is always there for us to explore. And so she really is a challenge to hone that space, to begin to lean more into intuition, to listen to dreams, to enact more of that feminine principle of wisdom. And that to me is very much that heroine's journey that we've been talking about. It's an inward journey, and it allows us to contract into that space where we can enter into the mysteries and ask ourselves what's really going on underneath the surface, and then to become much more literate in that language. To me, the priestess acts as like a gateway also to the realms of the moon and to the hermit. I don't know if anyone's ever thought about it this way, but when I was learning the tarot, I just felt that there were such similar themes coming up between the inward journey of the hermit and that kind of subtle unknown world of the moon. And how does that play into the priestess? Well, to me, she is that threshold guardian. And as we actually enter in through those pillars, we can go on the inward journey of the hermit. We can interact with the shadow of the moon, but it all starts with her. She is the teacher. She's the inner teacher, though, compared to the Hierophant, who's much more of that exoteric principle of guidance. She's the inward guiding principle. So really learning her language and being open to it is a major lesson that I get from the priestess.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I would just, there's not much more I would say about that other than I really like how you connect language to this, because I think it's sort of a, when I personally, the High Priestess is one that connects with me, and it's usually, I often interpret it as a sign that I either need to take in some sort of knowledge, or I need to clarify something that I already have but haven't quite put into words. And that's kind of like where the book comes into it. It's like I have to either I need to get what's here into some sort of like translatable form so I can, start to contemplate it, or I need to reconnect with the sources that nourish me spiritually, I guess, for lack of a better word. That's one of the number one messages that I connect with the High Priestess. Yeah.
I had the same advice as Alyssa. I was rushing out of a party doing single card readings, vulgar single card readings. And the High Priestess came up. And I just said, pay attention to your dreams. That was the single, like the reduction of the card to that one. That is what had to be done in that case. So I completely agree.
As the Marseille person, I will add one thing. We tend to be fairly literal sometimes. As much as I love the psychological approach, obviously, as I'm doing this, I would say sometimes the High Priestess means you're going to sit down next to a lady on a bus who's going to be reading something, and she's got to tell you something, and you should listen. So I'm just throwing that out there.
Just generally speaking, for the High Priestess, I definitely try to just reduce it down to kind of like feminine power or feminine wisdom, and that could take many different forms. But one of those forms could be to be like the spider in some sense of like, instead of trying to run out and like grab things and tackle things and grasp, which is a very masculine way of doing things, like let things come to you, like weave the web and then wait, be patient, take a seat, be still. Those are all, for me, because I feel like I'm a very masculine person in the way that I problem solve and orient towards the world. The High Priestess is very important to balance me out. But also getting more literal, I do think, it can just be like, have you been keeping up with your spiritual practice? Like whatever that is. Like, do you meditate? Have you been doing that? If you stopped meditating for whatever reason, maybe you should return to that. Have you spent enough time alone? Are you reading enough? Are you kind of relying on just like your gut and your intuition enough? Because those things easily slide away in sort of the hustle and bustle of trying to live. So I find that useful as far as reading goes. The High Priestess to me is just like, it's feminine power. Like, where's your feminine power? And whatever that means to you is just lean into that. Remember that, you might say.
All right, let's move to another audience question. Zero Sutra, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Otherwise, just indicate in the chat and I'll read it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I mean, you guys basically answered it already. I was just pointing out the similarities to how, especially in the Thoth deck, how the veil is itself like a web, and how itself, Chris especially, he's talked about the digital anima, but what is the divine anima in this sense of what are the spider and web-like properties of it? You guys have already talked about it, but that's about it.
I think one aspect, kind of moving away from the more, you might say, like negative valence of the digital anima and her more devouring web, how I say this, weaving of the web, is to think about the priestess more as that archetype of the fates and how it's like the threads of fates that are being woven in this much greater cosmic capacity that we interact with. And if we bring up that imagery of, the fates actually at the spindle, weaving fates of individuals, we get into that more subtle space that the priestess really represents as the parts of ourself that are still influencing us, impacting us, but haven't really risen past the surface of consciousness to be more aware, which is why the priestess to me is more of that invitation to stillness, to allow ourselves to become more cognizant of the kind of tides that are moving us. And that kind of gets into more of the archetypal forces, or the Jungian complexes, or just aspects of unconscious material that are really the greater forces at play rather than the mere kind of desires and whims of ego consciousness. And to me, the priestess is the head of that. She is very much weaving those fates. And if we allow ourselves to come into relationship with her, we can understand what's happening, work with it, at least more consciously.
There's an irony to the concept of the digital anima that I'm not sure some of the people who have dug into the suggested reading, like who've read Ion, the comparison to Maya, to the spinning woman who produces illusion, that word is synonymous with reality. Maya is identical to reality. You know, when I'm describing the digital anima, and I'm describing this veil of illusion online, even then I'm not describing something evil in the same way that the Buddhists who describe reality as Maya are not describing evil. It just is. The digital anima, I think, though, as a so we've got the layers of the veil in these cards. The internet is kind of a superfluous and unnecessary additional veil that prevents you from clarity oftentimes. So there's immense positivity to the spider figure. It's really solely as its emanation online, I think that it becomes negative, because I think the world of Maya, the world of forms, is connected to the holy world. We can interact with divinity right here.
Let's move on to Lance. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, because I observed that more often than not, the High Priestess card is interpreted in a positive manner. But isn't it possible that using her great intuition and judgment, what happens is that it becomes encasing in the fact that she passes on judgment towards the individuals and raising them according to her intuition, judgment, how it should be. And wouldn't this constrict the person? And instead of becoming the high priestess wherein she brings wisdom and is a beacon of light, she becomes more like a prison warden.
You know, it's an interesting way of looking at it. I think that, especially in the trumps of the tarot, you know, these are such powerful archetypical forces that they always have a shadow element to them. And the prison warden one, that's kind of an interesting image. I guess to me, if I were to see a shadow side of it, it might be more of a keeper of secrets. And sometimes people who are keeping secrecy are doing it for, you know, to protect the sanctity of something. And yet other times people are keeping secrets to be deceptive. And so I suppose that if I were to see a shadow manifestation of the High Priestess in this sort of instance, I could see that there can be instances when there's a desire not to share, there's a desire not to give people what they would need to flourish, even if we did have access to that ourselves.
Yes, thank you for that. But do you know any books which expounds upon the darker forms of these tarot cards. Uh, what books could I read which expands upon that?
I don't think there's any one book that I've really found that encapsulates the complexity and depth of the tarot. And whenever I speak to others or teach the tarot, I always really recommend finding many, many different resources and comparing and contrasting. There's the meditations on the tarot that Matt's been talking about a lot, and that's going to go into some real depth and power, 70 degrees of wisdom. There's lots of great Thoth books. The actual book of Thoth is, read that by Crowley, the pictorial key with Waite. But to me, it's really about giving yourself time and space to work with the cards, because they really reveal themselves over time. And it's a very layered experience. But to Matt's point, like, each of these cards are not wholly positive or negative as archetypes. They can move across the spectrum of expression. And so the priestess can have a negative valence. She can be in shadow, and maybe it could be like that type of prison ward. But I would also look to other cards in a reading to get a gut check on what's coming up. And I just, pulled out a few, like, say you got the priestess and she's reversed, which to me is already showing some sort of like tension to the archetype, and it's matched with like the devil. It's like, what comes forward? Maybe you really feel that sense of imprisonment, or you get something like the Eight of Swords. Like, this already is thinking about limitations and dynamics of restriction, or to Matt's point about like secrets, like maybe you get the Seven of Swords. So you start to learn the nuance and how these cards relate to each other by the relationship of all of them out in a spread. But look towards all different resources, a lot of books out there, and none of them really have the answer. I would say the cards really, the symbolism, the archetypes really will speak to you over time. All right, I think we maybe have time for one last question before we close things up. So I wanted to call on Guadalupe. You had a question. Did you want to unmute yourself and ask? Okay. He might have left, but I'll go ahead and ask that question for the panel here. So Guadalupe asks, can we relate Carl Jung's concept of the anima archetype to the High Priestess? And would it be the same for men and women? Any thoughts, guys?
Certainly. And as we've said, one third of her. I remember that with the dream that I talked about earlier, that was my first question, because I had a sensation, like there's a dream sensation. I can tell when it's an anima dream because there's a feeling to it. And I thought, that's odd. She's old. She's so much older in this form. Is it still the anima? And I saw that there were different, appearances, different kind of figures within the anima. And I found that very impressive. That was one of the very first things that really got me searching again, was that dream of the High Priestess.
That recalls to mind Eric Neumann's work with the Great Mother archetype, and how we see these different iterations through something as, from Isis or Sophia or the Virgin Mary, and also the more shadowy aspects. And even when we look at the development of the anima figure from a more classic Jungian point of view, it might be something that is first the mother image, and then it might turn into something driven more by the erotic feminine that we're relating to, and it might eventually evolve into something much more transcendent in nature, being more of that image of Sophia or the Virgin Mary. And so the iterations of the anima, how we interact with the feminine principle, is going to have these different manifestations, and how it affects a more masculine or feminine consciousness, I think, is also different. But at its heart, the anima really is our interaction with the transcendent principle of the feminine, and that exists inside all of us, whether we are male or female, and our relationship to that is going to be colored by our subjectivity in relation to these aspects in our everyday life. But to me, the priestess is the interaction with some versions of that in her expression. To me, most deeply, the more higher sort of spiritual transcendent version. But we can see by looking at other lineages as well, that there might be more of like the maiden anima as well. So lots of different versions of anima expression in the priestess card.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up to date with our projects, attend one of our live events, or work one-on-one with myself or Arran, head to www.goldenshadow.org.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.